Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine two figures revered by billions across the globe, yet often seen as cornerstones of entirely separate, sometimes even, well, competing spiritual traditions. Jesus of Nazareth and Lord Krishna.
Right. We typically encounter their stories and teachings within pretty distinct religious frameworks, don't we?
Absolutely. But what if, at their absolute core, their lives, their profound impact, and the truths they pointed to were actually expressions of the same ultimate reality?
That's the radical and deeply fascinating premise at the heart of the sources we're diving into today. They propose that throughout human history in different cultures and times, you get these extraordinary beings appearing.
Often called avatars or divine incarnations.
Exactly. And the sources suggest these aren't merely historical figures, but they actually embody a spiritual truth that is universal, timeless. It sort of transcends the cultural packaging, you know.
Okay. And why do they appear? What's the idea there?
Well, according to this view, they emerge to reestablish Dharma.
Dharma, that fundamental universal law of righteousness and cosmic order.
Precisely. And crucially, to illuminate the path back to self-realization for all humanity.
And we've got a really intriguing stack of source material here, articles, research, interpretive texts, that takes this idea and, well, really runs with it, exploring it in pretty significant depth.
Yeah, it's quite a collection.
So our mission in this deep dive is to take this rich material, carefully unpack its core arguments and insights, and, extract the most important nuggets of knowledge.
Kind of sift through it all.
Exactly. We want to help you, the listener, understand the central ideas presented and perhaps offer a perspective that allows you to see these incredible figures and maybe even the nature of spirituality itself in a completely new, maybe more unifying light.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to being really well-informed on a concept that definitely challenges conventional religious boundaries.
Yeah, it certainly does.
And when you even just look at the biographical narratives of Jesus and Krishna, sort of surface level, before getting into the deeper teachings, the sources point out these striking, almost uncanny similarities.
Like what, specifically?
Well, both are said to have had miraculous births. Prophesied events. And these births were then immediately met with persecution and threats from tyrannical rulers.
Right. You have King Herod seeking to destroy the infant Jesus.
And King Kamsa fearing the infant Krishna. Very similar pattern. Then both figures grew up to offer these incredibly powerful teachings, often centered on principles like love and righteousness.
And both ultimately faced situations that demanded, well, immense personal sacrifice.
Right. The parallels are quite stark when laid out like that.
Now, it's worth acknowledging, and the sources do touch on this, that some historical analysis might look at this differently, maybe exploring possibilities of cultural exchange or borrowing between traditions over millennia.
Sure, that's a valid academic perspective.
Yeah.
But the sources we're focusing on today take a different tack. They frame these similarities not primarily as, say, historical accidents or cultural diffusion.
But through a deeper, more spiritual, almost psychological lens?
Yes, exactly. They see these recurring narrative elements, the tyrant, the miraculous birth, the threat, the escape, as powerful archetypal expressions of the soul's universal journey towards divine consciousness.
So the tyrant isn't just a historical bad guy.
From this perspective, no. He represents the despotic ego within each of us, that part of our consciousness that instinctively fears and tries to suppress the first stirrings of divine awareness when they begin to be born within us.
I see. The ego fighting back against spiritual awakening.
Precisely. And the flight to safety, the families escaping in both stories. That symbolizes the necessary inner withdrawal and protection required to nurture that nascent spiritual awakening. You have to shield it from the distracting, sometimes hostile influences of the purely material world.
So the stories themselves become symbolic roadmaps of the inner process of enlightenment.
That's the interpretation, yes. A psycho-spiritual roadmap.
That's a really potent way to view these narratives. So the core unifying lens that our deep dive will explore then is one articulated by the great Indian yogi master Paramahansa Yogananda. He spoke extensively about something he termed Christ consciousness.
And this concept is absolutely central to the source material's entire argument. According to these texts, Christ consciousness is not presented as a state of being or an awareness exclusive to the historical man, Jesus of Nazareth.
Okay, that's a big point right there.
It is. Instead, they present it as a universal cosmic state of God realization, a supreme level of awareness that Jesus embodied perfectly, just as Lord Krishna did in another time and culture.
So it's described as the fully awakened, omnipresent intelligence and the utterly unconditional love of God.
Yes, but not just God existing transcendentally, like out there. It's God is reflected and present within all of creation, permeating everything.
Right, so the divine spark within.
Yeah, exactly. In this view, Jesus served as the perfect vessel, the pure channel, for this universal consciousness in the Western spiritual tradition.
While Krishna served that same role in the Eastern tradition.
Precisely. It's posited as the same divine awareness, the same ultimate destination that both these great masters pointed humanity towards.
And this state of consciousness, it's not just for a select few avatars.
No, absolutely not. The sources really emphasize that it is the inherent, though often latent, birthright of every single soul. The path they taught is essentially how to awaken that potential within yourself.
Okay, that gives us the foundational idea. That's quite a framework.
It really is.
So now that we understand this concept of a universal Christ consciousness, we can dive much deeper. We need to explore what the sources say it is, metaphysically speaking.
Get into the nuts and bolts of the definition.
Yeah. Then we'll explore the compelling parallels they draw between the core teachings of Jesus and Krishna. Look at significant mystical experiences in their lives as maybe symbolic stages on this universal path.
Right, the inner journey markers.
And discuss the absolutely critical role of surrender to the divine will. That seems key.
It's presented as the pinnacle, really.
And finally, we'll see how this profound, unifying theme echoes across other spiritual traditions. We'll look at figures like Swami Vivekananda, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's own guru, and even the medieval Christian mystic Meister Eckhart.
Okay, let's unpack this.
All right, let's really dig into the core of this perspective now by unpacking what this universal Christ consciousness actually means as defined in our source material, particularly through Paramahansa Yogananda's lens. The sources really stress that Yogananda provided a metaphysical definition, one specifically designed to lift the concept beyond, sectarian boundaries and reveal it as this cosmic, universally accessible reality.
Yes, he really aimed to sort of demystify it in a way and show its scientific universal nature. He defines Christ consciousness quite specifically as the projected consciousness of God immanent in all creation.
Immanent, meaning dwelling within.
Exactly. Think of it as the spiritual essence, the divine spark that isn't just hidden deep within the core of every human individual, but is actually present and vibrating at the very heart of every single atom, every particle of the universe.
Every single atom. That's an incredibly expansive view. It means the divine isn't just up there or in here, but truly everywhere.
It does. It permeates absolutely everything. And fascinatingly, our sources highlight that this universal intelligence, this immanent divine presence, has a corresponding name in India's ancient Sanskrit scriptures. Kutastha Chaitanya.
Kutastha Chaitanya. Okay, can we break that down?
Sure. Kutastha literally means something like on the summit or standing like a pillar. It implies something unchanging, a fixed point, stable, like the peak of a mountain or a central axis around which everything else moves.
Immutable.
Immutable, exactly. And Chaitanya just means consciousness or intelligence. So Kutastha Chaitanya is understood as the immutable universal consciousness that stands as the silent, unchanging witness and the intelligent principle at the very core of all manifested creation.
Okay, unchanging consciousness at the core. And the sources make a direct link here, stating that this Kutastha Chaitanya is what the Christian Bible refers to as the only begotten Son. Now, that seems like a pretty significant leap for many people's understanding.
It is, absolutely. And Yogananda's interpretation is really crucial here. He explains that in this metaphysical context, begotten doesn't refer to a singular historical event, like the physical birth of one man.
Not the nativity story specifically.
No. Instead, he interprets it to signify the eternal, ever-present reflection of the unmanifest Spirit, God the Father, the Absolute, who is beyond creation, within the realm of manifestation, within the created universe.
So God the Father is transcendent. beyond.
And Christ consciousness is his soul, pure, perfect, direct reflection within creation itself. It's called only begotten because from this perspective, it is the only consciousness, the only true intelligence that actually permeates all matter. It's the one pure image of the transcendent Father existing and operating within the cosmos.
So Christ consciousness isn't just a quality of a person, it's the underlying spiritual reality of the universe.
Exactly that. It's presented as the fundamental conscious substance from which everything is made. It's also described in these sources, quite interestingly, as the holy, sacred cosmic vibration.
The creative energy principle.
Yes, referred to as the Word in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and as Amam, or Om in the Vedas and Upanishads. This vibratory power, Arom, is seen as the source of all life, the very fabric and sustaining power of the universe itself.
Wow, that really connects the act of creation with a conscious spiritual principle.
Yeah.
And how do we as individuals, how do we interact with this or attain this state?
Well, the sources explain that the path lies in expanding our individual awareness. When a soul is able, through practice and grace, to consistently lift its consciousness beyond the limitations, beyond the physical body, the senses, the emotions, the small, confined personality, the ego.
To go beyond the small self.
Yes, and to consciously identify instead with this omnipresent spirit, this universal consciousness.
Yeah.
That is when it attains Christ consciousness. This is the state that masters like Jesus and Krishna fully realized and continuously lived from. They didn't just have it, they were it in their fully awakened state.
It's still quite an abstract concept, I think, for many listeners, maybe myself included, to fully grasp. Did Yogananda use any simpler ways, maybe analogies, to explain this divine interplay?
Yes, he was actually very skilled with analogies. He offered several to help make these rather abstract realities more relatable.
Right.
One key one is the analogy of the sun and the crystal ball.
Okay, the sun and the crystal ball. Walk us through that one.
All right. Imagine, before creation exists, there is only God the Father, like the sun existing alone in the vast empty sky. The sun is transcendent, it's unmanifest on earth directly, it's the source of all light and energy.
Okay, God is the sun.
Right. Now, when God decides to project creation, it's like placing an enormous, perfectly clear crystal ball into the path of that sunlight. This vast crystal ball represents the entire universe of vibratory matter, of creation.
The manifested cosmos.
Exactly. Now, according to the analogy, you have three distinct yet totally interrelated entities. First, God the Father, the Son, beyond the crystal ball, the transcendent source.
Outside creation.
Right. Second, the Son, or Christ consciousness, which is the perfect, pure reflection of the sun within the crystal ball. This represents the immanent, intelligent presence of God pervading all of creation.
So the light inside the ball.
Precisely. And third, the Holy Ghost, or Turum, which is represented by the actual substance of the crystal ball itself. The vibratory cosmic energy that constitutes the universe and acts as the medium for that reflection to even be possible. It's the power that structures and sustains creation.
Ah, okay. So the Christ consciousness isn't a totally separate entity, but the Father's perfect reflection dwelling within his creation, enabled by the Holy Ghost, or Ainum.
Exactly. It beautifully illustrates the concept of God being both transcendent, the Father, the Son, and immanent, the Son, the reflection within, through the power of the Holy Ghost, the substance of the ball. It's quite elegant, really.
It is. You mentioned another analogy, the cosmic dreamer.
Yes, I like that one too. The idea here is that God, in his infinite consciousness, dreams the entire universe into existence.
Like a divine dream.
Exactly. And within this vast cosmic dream, we as individual souls have become deeply, deeply identified with just one tiny character within the dream. Our limited ego personality, our body, our thoughts, our personal history.
We think we are just that character.
Right. And from the perspective of this single dream character, we perceive everyone and everything else in the dream as separate and external to us. The spiritual path, in this analogy, is the process of waking up within this cosmic dream.
Ah, realizing it's all a dream, or at least dreamlike.
Well, not necessarily that it's not real, but that its reality is entirely dependent on the dreamer. An enlightened master, like Jesus or Krishna, is a soul who is fully awakened within the dream to the realization that everything within it, every person, every animal, every mountain, every star, every single atom, is made of the same fundamental substance. the consciousness of the dreamer.
And they realize they aren't just the character.
But they are, in essence, the dreamer itself. They realize their true identity is not the limited dream character they appear to be, but the omnipresent consciousness of the dreamer who is manifesting it all.
So our task is to wake up inside the dream.
That's how Yogananda explained it through this analogy, yes. Our task is to awaken from this cosmic dream of separateness, to find God hidden within his own creation, and ultimately realize our inherent eternal unity with the Creator, who is simultaneously the dreamer of the cosmos and the consciousness residing within each of us.
This perspective really reframes the whole idea of salvation or spiritual fulfillment, doesn't it? It sounds like it shifts it dramatically from something external we wait for to something internal we actively awaken.
It absolutely does. And this understanding of a universal Christ consciousness residing potentially within everyone, this is presented as the core meaning behind the title of Paramahansa Yogananda's extensive commentary on the Gospels, the second coming of Christ, the resurrection of the Christ within you.
So the second coming isn't necessarily a future physical event happening outside of us.
According to these sources, that common belief, while holding a sacred place for many, often externalizes and postpones what is meant to be an immediate, ever-present internal potential reality. The true second coming isn't interpreted here as a future return of the historical Jesus descending externally from the clouds.
But rather,
it is the immediate, ever-available resurrection and awakening of this universal Christ consciousness within the individual consciousness of every single person who, through sincere spiritual effort, divine love, and dedicated inner work, prepares their own heart and mind to receive and embody it.
so it's not about waiting for Christ to return to us, but actively participating in resurrecting the Christ potential, the divine spark within ourselves.
Yes, precisely. The sources state that Yogananda taught that Jesus himself, actually, in his post-resurrection appearances to disciples like James, expressed a desire for the profound scientific techniques of Kriya Yoga to be sent to the West.
Why Kriya Yoga specifically?
Precisely to reveal and facilitate this deeper, experiential, inner meaning of Christianity. The promise of Christ's return, in this view, is fulfilled not when a physical body appears in the sky, but when the individual soul, through a scientific method of inner transformation and divine love, resurrects its own latent divinity. The return is the conscious realization and active living of the principles and the state of being for which Jesus stood: unconditional love, infinite forgiveness, absolute oneness with God.
That shift in perspective seems incredibly significant. It moves the whole locus of salvation, you could say, from an external savior or a future event to the individual's personal responsibility for their own inner awakening and transformation right now.
It really is a fundamental reorientation. And crucially, by defining Christ as the universal Kutasa Chaitanya, Yogananda effectively demonopolizes the concept, doesn't he?
So.
He makes this state of divine consciousness accessible, at least in principle, to sincere seekers of any spiritual background. Hindu, Buddhist, yogi, Sufi, Christian mystic, even an agnostic exploring consciousness.
Yeah.
Any path that values inner realization.
Yeah. It opens the door universally.
Exactly. And this universal foundation is what allows the sources to then assert that Krishna, as another perfect avatar, also fully manifested and taught the path to this exact same consciousness. This lays the groundwork for seeing their core teachings not as contradictory, but as unified.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because once you have that foundational idea of a universal Christ consciousness, these proposed parallels in their teachings, well, they move beyond just superficial similarities, don't they? They become powerful indicators that maybe they were pointing to the same fundamental reality and the same path to get there.
Exactly right. Through this lens of a shared divine realization, the teachings of Jesus and Krishna are presented not as separate, potentially conflicting religious doctrines, but as two culturally distinct yet harmoniously aligned expressions of one single universal gospel, the gospel of self-realization.
And what is the absolute core truth this universal gospel points to, according to these sources?
The sources consistently emphasize that the ultimate human purpose, the whole reason for our existence and struggles, is really to consciously turn our attention and energy away from the fleeting illusions and, frankly, distractions of the outer material world.
The shiny objects.
Right. And instead, discover the eternal kingdom of God, or the true self, the Atman that resides permanently within us.
Which immediately brings to mind Jesus' famous statement, the kingdom of God is within you, Luke 17.21. It's right there.
Right there, a clear directive pointing inward. And Krishna, in the Bhagavad Gita, repeatedly guides Arjuna to realize this indwelling self, the immortal Atman. The Gita teaches that this Atman isn't just some personal soul, but is an eternal, immutable, and totally inseparable part of the universal spirit, Brahman.
It's not created or destroyed.
The scripture is quite explicit. The Atman is neither born nor does it die at any time. It is unborn, eternal, permanent, and primeval. The Atman is not destroyed when the body is destroyed. Both masters, in their own ways, conveyed that true, lasting happiness, real peace, genuine freedom. These are not found in piling up external possessions or achieving worldly success. They're found in this inner realization of our divine, immortal essence.
So the real treasure, the real kingdom, is internal, not external.
Precisely. And the sources highlight how certain scriptural narratives, particularly the Bhagavad Gita, can be read psychologically as powerful allegories for this inner journey. Paramahansa Yogananda's commentaries often take this approach,
Right, like the battlefield.
Exactly. The Bhagavad Gita's famous setting, the battlefield of Kurukshetra, isn't just presented as some historical war between ancient Indian armies.
It's the inner battlefield within each of us.
That's the interpretation. It's depicted as an allegory for the perpetual inner battle that every single human soul must fight within their own consciousness to overcome delusion, ignorance, and achieve spiritual freedom.
And the characters represent part of ourselves.
Yes. Arjuna, the great warrior protagonist, he represents the aspiring seeker, the individual soul. Initially, he's paralyzed by doubt, grief, and profound detachment to his worldly habits, relationships, desires, symbolized by his enemy kinsman on the battlefield, the things he has to fight but feels connected to.
And Krishna.
Krishna, his divine charioteer and spiritual guide, represents the voice of the indwelling God consciousness, the Atman, or the Christ consciousness, residing in the heart. He's guiding the soul, Arjuna, to victory over the ego's vast and often very subtle forces.
Like what kind of forces?
Doubts, fears, negative habits, limiting beliefs, cravings, aversions, pride, anger, all forms of erroneous thinking that keep us bound. The entire dialogue of the Gita in this psychological reading is Krishna teaching Arjuna how to align his will and actions with Dharma, with universal righteousness and cosmic law.
But not for external gain, like winning the war for its own sake.
No, not primarily. The goal is aligning with Dharma for the ultimate purpose of self-realization, of waking up.
That interpretation really makes the Gita a deeply personal, internal drama playing out within each listener, doesn't it?
It does. It becomes universally relevant.
And when we look at the specific core teachings presented by Jesus and Krishna, viewed through this lens of self-realization, the parallels highlighted in the sources are more than just, thematic similarities. They feel profoundly resonant.
They are presented almost as mirror images of the same universal truths, just expressed in different cultural contexts. Let's look at some of the key thematic parallels the sources highlight.
Okay. First, there's the absolute centrality of love and devotion, which in the yogic path is known as Bhakti Yoga.
Right. Jesus gave what he called the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. That's a call for total, all-consuming devotion.
Nothing held back.
Nothing. And Krishna echoes this constantly throughout the Bhagavad Gita. He makes explicit promises of divine grace and protection to those who are devoted to him with unwavering love. Like the verse, to those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, I provide what they lack and preserve what they have.
So a promise of divine care for the devotee.
Yes. Both masters emphasize cultivating a deep, loving personal relationship with the divine as a primary means to purify the heart, transcend the ego's self-centeredness, and ultimately merge consciousness with the beloved, with God.
Okay, love and devotion. Then there's the principle of detachment from materialism and maybe more subtly from the fruits of our actions. This aligns directly with karma yoga, right?
Exactly. Jesus warned his followers pointedly, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up treasures in heaven.
Focus on the spiritual, not just the material.
Right. And Krishna provides the sort of philosophical and psychological underpinnings for this detachment in the Gita. He teaches the principle of vairagya.
Vairagya. dispassion.
Dispassion or non-attachment. Specifically, non-attachment to the results or fruits of your actions. He vividly explains the deceptive nature of purely sensory happiness, saying it might seem like nectar at first, but it ultimately ends like poison.
Because it's temporary and leads to craving.
Exactly. True lasting peace, Krishna teaches, comes from performing your duty, your rightful action, dharma, with full engagement and skill, but without craving the results or being agitated by the outcomes, whether they appear as success or failure.
Just doing the action for its own sake as an offering.
Yes. Krishna states, the self-controlled soul who moves amongst sense objects, free from either attachment or repulsion, he wins eternal peace. That is the very essence of karma yoga, disciplined action performed without selfish desire for results, offered up to the divine.
And this seems to lead naturally into the next parallel, the emphasis on humility and selfless service.
Absolutely. Both Jesus and Krishna perfectly exemplified this principle in their own lives, despite their, divine stature. Jesus, the Master, humbled himself to wash the feet of his disciples, a servant's task.
And Krishna,
presented in the Gita as the Supreme Lord of the universe, took on the incredibly humble role of being Arjuna's charioteer on the battlefield, driving his chariot, guiding him.
They both showed that true spiritual greatness is found not in being served, but in selfless service to others, seeing the divine spark within them.
Right. Jesus declared, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And Krishna instructs Arjuna to perform actions for the welfare of the world, lokasamgra. But again, always without any selfish, ego-driven motive. Service itself becomes a powerful path to ego transcendence.
Okay. Love, detachment, service, and perhaps the most profound parallel, the one that speaks most directly to this idea of a shared Christ consciousness, oneness with the divine absolute.
Yes. This is where the voices of fully realized masters become unmistakably clear, cutting right through the illusion of separation that binds most of us. Jesus' astonishing statement, I and my Father are one, John 10:30,
which has caused so much debate and interpretation over centuries,
is presented in these sources not as a unique, exclusive claim of one particular man, but as the authentic voice of fully realized Christ consciousness. It's the perfect reflection within creation, proclaiming its absolute identity with the transcendent source, the Father.
And Krishna says similar things.
Oh, yes. Krishna makes similar, incredibly powerful declarations throughout the Bhagavad Gita, revealing his true nature not just as Arjuna's friend and charioteer, but as the omnipresent, absolute reality from which all existence emanates. He says things like, I am the origin of everything. From me, everything arises.
The source of all.
And, perhaps most profoundly, I am the self, O Gautakesha Arjuna, resident in the inner self of all beings. I am the beginning and the middle and the end of all beings. BG 10.20.
Residing in all beings.
In all beings. Both were pointing beyond their physical human form to the universal, non-dual spirit that animated them. And the crucial point the sources make is that this is the very same spirit that is your true, essential reality hidden within you right now.
So it's not just that they shared similar moral philosophies or ethical guidelines, although they did. They were both demonstrating and pointing the way to the same fundamental non-dual truth of absolute oneness with the divine, a state of being that is potentially inherent within everything.
Exactly. They weren't just great teachers of philosophy. They were living embodiments of this truth, showing humanity the path back to that same realization within themselves.
Okay, let's pause for a moment and really bring this back to you, the listener, because these aren't just fascinating ancient texts or historical comparisons, are they?
Not at all. They're meant to be practical, relevant.
So how do you deal with the inner conflict that is your own personal kurukshetra, that inner battle? How does attachment to the outcomes of your actions, whether it's about your job, a creative project, a relationship, a personal goal, how does that affect your inner peace and happiness, just as Krishna describes?
Does it bring anxiety? Frustration, elation followed by a crash.
Right. And could the perspective of seeing service, even small acts, not as a chore, but as a path to spiritual growth and true greatness, could that change how you approach your daily interactions and responsibilities?
And maybe most importantly, what does this radical idea of a divine essence, the Atman or Christ consciousness, residing potentially within you right now? What does that truly mean for your sense of self, your potential, your limitations, and your ultimate purpose in this world?
These are the kinds of personal reflections this material really seems to invite.
They are indeed.
Moving on, the sources highlight something really interesting about the significant mystical experiences described in the lives of Jesus and Krishna. They argue these aren't just, isolated supernatural events or cool miracle stories. They're presented as profound symbols, almost like portals to higher states of consciousness.
Yes, and more than that, they seem to represent a specific sequence or a kind of roadmap for the soul's journey towards full God realization. There's a logic to them.
A sequence. What's the pattern?
Well, broadly, they depict a two-stage process. First, there's the essential preparation, the mastery of the inner world, the microcosm of the self. And this is seen as leading to, or being a prerequisite for, the second stage, the realization of the entire outer world, the macrocosm, as God, as an expression of that same divine consciousness.
Inner mastery first, then cosmic realization. Okay, let's start with the inner part. Jesus in the wilderness, his 40 days fasting, being tempted by Satan. The sources interpret this as far more than just, say, a historical endurance test or a simple morality tale.
Absolutely. It's described as a powerful archetypal allegory for the deep inner work required on any serious spiritual path, particularly reflecting the yogic path of purification and achieving mastery over the lower nature, the ego. It's not really about battling an external red-horned devil figure.
But confronting inner demons.
Exactly. It's seen as a symbolic, dramatic depiction of the advanced soul confronting and definitively overcoming the deepest, most subtle layers of its own egoic consciousness and the powerful temptations rooted in material identification.
And the setting, the wilderness itself, that has symbolic meaning, too.
Yes, it represents the necessity of solitude, of deep introspection, and that deliberate withdrawal from the incessant noise and distractions of the external world and the demanding senses. This inner space, this wilderness, is where you come face to face with your subtle inner enemies, your ingrained cravings, your hidden pride, your deepest fears.
Okay. And the three specific temptations Jesus faced are presented as archetypes of egoic challenges.
That's right. Universal challenges. First, the temptation of turning stones into bread after 40 days of fasting.
The physical need.
Yes, it symbolizes the temptation of the flesh, the powerful pull of physical needs, sensory gratification, and material desires. These can become incredibly intense after periods of asceticism or self-denial. Jesus' response, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God," signifies the absolute victory of spirit over the insistent demands of the body.
It represents mastering the vital drives.
Exactly. And realizing that true sustenance comes not from physical food alone, but from the divine life force, prana, and from spiritual communion.
Okay, that's the first. Second, the temptation of worldly power and kingdoms.
Right, the devil showing Jesus all the kingdoms of the world from a high mountain and offering them if he would just bow down and worship him. This is the archetypal temptation of the ego's deep lust for power, for control, for recognition, fame, and worldly dominion.
The ego wanting to be king of the world.
Pretty much. Jesus' absolute rejection of this offer affirms his complete and unwavering allegiance to a higher divine purpose. It's a fundamental renunciation of the ego's insatiable will to dominate and possess.
And the third temptation, often seen as the most subtle, spiritual pride.
Yes. Being taken to the highest point of the temple and tempted to leap off, relying on angels to dramatically save him, thereby proving his divinity through a sensational spectacle. This represents that insidious temptation of spiritual pride, the ego wanting to show off its spiritual attainments, needing external validation, craving miraculous display, even testing God, rather than having simple, humble faith.
Testing God.
Right. Jesus' refusal, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test," demonstrates profound faith, deep humility, and absolute trust in the divine will without needing any ostentatious proofs or validating the ego through displays of miraculous power.
And the sources see his victory over these three as a crucial stage, a kind of graduation on the path.
Yes, absolutely. This victory, achieved by wielding what the Bible calls the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, interpreted here as divine wisdom and unwavering faith, symbolizes the attainment of a profoundly purified consciousness. It represents the mastery of the self's microcosm, the complete conquest of the inner demons of egoic desire and pride.
And this connects to yogic practices.
The sources correlate this stage directly to advanced yogic practices like pratyahara, the conscious interiorization and withdrawal of the senses from external objects, and dharana, deep, unwavering concentration. These are seen as essential prerequisites for attaining higher states of consciousness, like dhyana, meditation, and ultimately samadhi union.
Okay, so that's the mastery of the inner landscape, the microcosm, powerfully symbolized by Jesus in the wilderness. Now let's turn to the other side of the coin, Krishna's Virat Rupa. That terrifying and sublime vision of the cosmic macrocosm shown to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes, exactly. If the wilderness represents the essential purification and mastery required to turn inward and conquer the self, the Virat Rupa represents the subsequent potential stage, the realization of the entire outer world, the macrocosm, as being nothing other than God himself. It's depicted as the ultimate mystical experience where individual consciousness radically expands to comprehend and merge with the cosmic scale of divine reality.
And what was the context? What state was Arjuna in that led to Krishna revealing this vision?
Arjuna was on the battlefield, utterly paralyzed by profound moha.
Moha.
Delusion. Delusion, yes, rooted deeply in the illusion of separation. He saw his relatives, his teachers, his friends in the opposing army, and he was just overwhelmed by personal grief, crippling attachment, and total confusion about his duty, his dharma. This personal crisis is presented in the sources as the universal crisis of the soul when it's trapped in the illusion of I and mine, the delusion of being just a separate, limited individual actor in a world full of other separate beings.
So Krishna's revelation of the Virat Rupa is like divine intervention, spiritual medicine.
Exactly. It's given specifically to cure this fundamental ignorance of separation.
And what did Arjuna actually witness? It sounds overwhelming.
It's described as utterly shattering. Granted divine sight by Krishna's grace, because ordinary human eyes simply cannot perceive this form. Arjuna saw a vision that exploded all conventional perceptions of time, space, and individual form. It was described as having innumerable faces, eyes, mouths, adorned with celestial ornaments, wielding divine weapons.
Containing everything.
Everything. It contained all the worlds, all creatures, all gods, all demons, all forces of nature, and all ages of time simultaneously within itself. He witnessed the endless cycles of creation and destruction unfolding within the single, infinite, effulgent form.
Both beautiful and terrifying, the sources say?
Yes, because it's the absolute revealing itself as containing all dualities, all aspects of existence, the light and the dark, creation and destruction. It was the direct, undeniable experience of God, not as something separate or external, but as the sole underlying reality, the beginning, the middle, and the end of absolutely all things.
That sounds like the very culmination of the yogic path, reaching cosmic consciousness.
It is described precisely as that a direct initiation into cosmic consciousness, a state of samadhi, ecstatic union. In that moment, Arjuna's limited, ego-bound viewpoint is just annihilated. He sees that his personal grief and attachment were based entirely on a false perception of separateness.
He realizes he's not the doer.
Exactly. He realizes he is not the individual doer, not the sole actor in the cosmic drama. Rather, the vast cosmic forces, the divine will itself, are acting through everyone and everything. This vision is presented as curing the fundamental delusion of being a separate, independent agent.
So you can really see the sequence the sources are proposing. First, the intense inner purification and conquest of the ego, symbolized by Jesus' trials in the wilderness.
Right, mastering the microcosm.
Followed by the potential expansion of consciousness to perceive the entire cosmic reality as divine, like Krishna's revelation of the Virat Rupa.
Exactly. The soul's journey, according to this perspective, is inherently twofold. First, there's that necessary inward turn, the purification of the heart, the conquest of the ego's demands, and its subtle attachments powerfully represented by Jesus' trials. This mastery of the inner microcosm is presented as absolutely essential.
Why essential?
Because an impure, unmastered consciousness, still clinging desperately to ego and attachment, would simply not be able to withstand or integrate the sheer shock and immensity of the cosmic vision. It would likely be shattered by it. Look at Arjuna's initial terror. He needed Krishna's special grace and divine sight even to behold it without collapsing.
So the inner work prepares the vessel.
Precisely. Only the consciousness that has been purified and strengthened by mastering the inner self is truly prepared for the sublime, sometimes overwhelming, vision of the macrocosm. And that vision culminates in the direct experiential realization of absolute unity with the Christ-Krishna consciousness that pervades both the inner world of the self and the outer world of the cosmos.
Connecting this back to you, the listener, for a moment. Have you ever sought solitude, maybe on a retreat, or just quiet time alone, and found it a place where your internal struggles with cravings, perhaps, or ambition, or that nagging need for external validation actually intensified, became clearer?
Or conversely, have you ever experienced unexpected moments of profound peace, clarity, or sudden glimpses of an interconnectedness that felt much larger than your ordinary individual self?
These experiences, whether seemingly mundane or deeply profound, might be seen through the lens of these sources as echoes, however faint, of this universal journey. The journey of inward purification and expanding awareness that these great masters fully traversed and symbolically represented for all of us.
Right. And building directly on that foundation of inner mastery and the potential for cosmic vision, the sources really converge on the principle of surrender as the apex, the ultimate key that unlocks the door to full God realization.
And it's crucial, they stress, that this isn't seen as passive, weak resignation, like just giving up. It's presented as an active, conscious, and totally willing relinquishment of the limited egoic will to the greater divine will.
Precisely. This absolute surrender is presented as the practical, moment-to-moment method for dissolving that core illusion of separation we talked about. It's the bridge that takes you from intellectually understanding the principle God is the only doer to actually living that truth in your daily thoughts, feelings, and actions.
And the sources identify this principle perfectly embodied in two incredibly pivotal moments, one from each tradition: Jesus' agony and prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane,
and Krishna's core teaching on karma yoga, non-attached action, throughout the Bhagavad Gita.
Let's look at Gethsemane first. The name itself, olive press, is such a powerful metaphor for the intense pressure and spiritual struggle Jesus experienced there.
It really is. His agony, praying so intensely that the gospel says his sweat was like great drops of blood falling to the ground. This is depicted in the sources as the ego's final, most desperate struggle against the absolute demands of the divine will. In this case, the willingness to face the horror of the crucifixion.
The human self recoiling from suffering.
Naturally. And his prayer captures the very essence of this struggle and the ultimate choice he made. My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will.
That prayer, it's described as the ultimate act of bhakti, isn't it? Devotional surrender in the face of the greatest imaginable personal test.
Absolutely. It's the conscious fight to stop fighting the divine plan. The individual will, with all its natural human fear and its deep desire for self-preservation, "May this cup be taken from me," is consciously, willingly offered up and dissolved into the greater, all-knowing divine will. Not as I will, but as you will.
And the consequence of that surrender?
The profound consequence, according to this interpretation, was that this total surrender in the garden made Jesus inwardly invincible. When the soldiers came later to arrest him, they couldn't truly take his life against his will. Why? Because he had already, moments before, given everything his will, his life, his very self, completely to the Father.
So his life became an offering, not something taken by force.
Exactly. The spiritual battle, the true victory over the ego's resistance to the divine plan, was won inwardly, in the quiet agony of the garden on Thursday night, before the external physical events of Friday even unfolded. This total surrender, this offering of the self, is what freed him from the world's power to truly harm his inner state of consciousness.
That interpretation gives the Gethsemane narrative incredible spiritual depth. And Krishna's teaching on karma yoga is seen as the systematic Eastern counterpart to this very same principle of surrender.
Precisely. It's presented as a scientific method for achieving the same ego dissolution and surrender, but applied continuously, dynamically, in the midst of worldly action and the challenges of everyday life.
And the core principle, as we touched on earlier.
It's to perform your prescribed duty, your dharma, whatever it may be in your life's situation, with complete concentration, skill, and effort. But to utterly renounce any personal attachment to the fruits or results of those actions. Krishna states it very forcefully in the Gita. You have a right to perform your prescribed duties, but you are not entitled to the fruits of your actions. Never consider yourself the cause of the results of your activities, and never be attached to not doing your duty.
So the focus shifts entirely from what's in it for me to the rightness of the action itself and the internal attitude of offering it.
Exactly. The practitioner of karma yoga performs all actions not for personal gain or reward, but as an offering, a sacrifice yajna, to God. The internal mantra, whether spoken aloud or just held in consciousness, is essentially, I am not the doer, God is the doer, acting through me as an instrument.
And this practice directly undermines the ego.
Systematically, it starves the ego, which absolutely thrives on that sense of being the independent agent, on claiming ownership of success, and on being devastated or elated by outcomes. Detaching the sense of self from the results leads inevitably towards profound inner equanimity, that state of being balanced in success and failure, which Krishna actually defines as the very essence of yoga itself.
So karma yoga is a moment-to-moment practice of surrendering the ego's need to be in control and to claim agency over results.
That's exactly how it's presented, a continuous surrender through action.
So Gethsemane and karma yoga, when seen through this unifying lens, are not just different stories or unrelated practices, but two incredibly powerful expressions of the same core principle: ego surrender leading to divine union.
They were presented as two sides of the same ultimate spiritual truth. Jesus' supreme act of surrender in Gethsemane can be seen as the devotional peak, the ultimate expression of karma yoga, offering the ultimate action, his life, with perfect non-attachment to the outcome, his personal will versus the Father's will, surrendering the self entirely in love. Both paths, the devotional surrender in a moment of profound crisis, and the continuous surrender through detached action in daily life, are shown to lead ultimately to the same result: the symbolic death of the limited, fearful ego and the resurrection or birth of God consciousness, the realization of the true divine self.
And what this means for you, the listener: these practices, this principle of surrender, aren't just for historical saints or ancient warriors on a battlefield. The idea is that when the ego's tight grip is consciously surrendered, even little by little in the midst of your daily life,
the true self, the Atman, the Christ consciousness which was always there underneath, begins to emerge and operate more freely through you.
So you gradually become less of a self-interested actor, constantly struggling against the world, and more of a conscious instrument for the divine will, acting with potentially more love, wisdom, and effectiveness.
Yes, and free from the crippling weight of personal attachment, anxiety, and fear about outcomes. This is presented as practical non-duality, in action, experiencing life flowing through you as an expression of the divine, rather than feeling like life is just constantly happening to you, buffeting you around.
So a final thought for you on this section. How does the idea of surrender resonate with you personally? Does it instinctively feel like weakness, like giving up control, something to be avoided at all costs? Or could it possibly be seen as a profound, courageous strength, the strength to let go of the false self that ultimately leads to true inner freedom and power?
It's a deep question to ponder.
This perspective we've been exploring makes it really clear that the realization of this universal divine consciousness isn't something confined historically to just Jesus and Krishna, or geographically to just the East or the West. It's presented as the core truth of what's often called the Philosophia Perennis, the perennial philosophy.
Right, the idea that there's this timeless wisdom that lies at the heart of all great religious and spiritual traditions, especially when you look into their esoteric or mystical core beyond the surface level doctrines.
Suggesting that mystics throughout time and across different cultures, despite their very different outer forms of worship or belief systems, are essentially tapping into and describing the same fundamental reality.
Exactly. The sources suggest that when sincere seekers from any tradition go deeply inward, whether through prayer, meditation, contemplation, selfless service, whatever their path is, they begin to speak a common language.
A language of unity.
Yes, a language of unity, of direct experiential knowledge, what's sometimes called gnosis, and of realizing the presence of God consciousness, not somewhere far away in heaven, but intimately within themselves and pervading all things.
You mentioned gnosis. Is that related to the historical Gnostics?
Well, there's a connection, but here it's used more broadly. There's a thread that runs through spiritual history. sometimes called the Gnostic trajectory, using Gnostic in the sense of gnosis, direct knowing, rather than specifically the historical Gnostic sects, which were quite diverse. This trajectory prioritizes this personal experiential knowledge over mere intellectual belief or adherence to dogma, which is sometimes called pistis.
So knowing versus just believing.
Right. The focus is fundamentally on the transformation of the individual consciousness, what you become through a disciplined, even scientific approach to inner reality, not just what you intellectually ascend to.
So this perspective suggests the real spiritual divide isn't actually between external religions, like saying Christianity versus Hinduism.
That's a key insight presented very strongly in these sources, drawn directly from this perennial philosophy tradition. The true divide, they argue, lies within each religion itself.
Within? How so?
It's the divide between the outer exoteric shell, the dogma, the rituals, the institutional structures, which can often, unfortunately, create division, exclusivity, and conflict, and the inner esoteric core of direct spiritual experience and universal realization, which is inherently unifying.
And figures like Jesus and Krishna and other mystics are seen as champions of this inner unifying core.
Yes, absolutely. Often, frankly, to the discomfort of the more rigid outer establishments of their own times, they pointed beyond the forms to the formless reality.
And we see this perspective powerfully echoed in other major figures highlighted by the sources, like Swami Vivekananda, for instance.
Oh, definitely. Vivekananda was, in many ways, Paramahansa Yogananda's direct predecessor as a key messenger bringing India's deep spiritual wisdom, particularly Vedanta and yoga, to the West in a major way. His address at the 1893 World Parliament of Religions in Chicago is legendary. It's often described as a lion's roar of Vedanta because it just immediately captivated the audience with its bold message of universality and strength.
He presented Hinduism differently.
He presented it not just as a religion in the Western sense, but as a practical science of consciousness and self-realization. His absolute core teaching was that every soul is potentially divine and is inherently part of a vast universal consciousness. He stated clearly that the universe's entire energy and knowledge exists latent within us.
He used analogies too, didn't he?
Yes, like saying individual minds are just like little waves in the ocean of the infinite universal mind. His whole mission, much like that described for the avatars, was fundamentally to help humanity realize this universal infinite consciousness already residing within themselves.
And he explicitly called for breaking down the religious barriers that divide people.
Passionately. He urged the rejection of sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism, proposing the yogic spirit of recognizing fundamental oneness as the only lasting solution to religious conflict. He taught that self-realization, the awakening of the divine within, is the ultimate goal shared by all religions, whether they articulate it that way or not. And that recognizing the one self, the Atman or Brahman, in all beings is the only true and unshakable basis for ethics, morality, and universal compassion.
So ethical behavior flows naturally from realizing oneness.
Exactly. It's not just about following external rules. It's about living from that inner truth of interconnectedness.
It's fascinating how this message of unity spans generations and continents. And Paramahansa Yogananda's own guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, seems to have made this explicit unity the central theme of his main written work.
Absolutely. Sri Yukteswar's book, though quite slim, is incredibly profound. It's called The Holy Science. The original Bengali title is Kaivalya Darsana, which means something like the vision of oneness. And it was written, as he states very clearly in the introduction, with the specific purpose to show clearly that there is an essential unity in all religions, and that there is but one goal toward which all religions are marching.
He directly compared scriptures.
Meticulously. He drew parallels, often quoting passages side by side from Christian scriptures, like the Book of Revelation or the Gospels, and Hindu scriptures, like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, to demonstrate point by point that they taught the same underlying divine principles, just using different terminology and cultural metaphors. He very boldly stated that Jesus and Krishna, despite being separated by thousands of years and miles, taught the exact same essential path to God realization.
And he used specific technical terms to show that correlation, like Yogananda did later.
Yes, he did. He directly correlated the Christian concept of the Holy Ghost, or the Word, understood as the primal creative vibration, with the Hindu concept of awam, or om, describing them as identical truths perceived through direct cosmic intuition. He also explicitly correlated Christ consciousness with Kutasa Chaitanya, the unchanging universal consciousness we discussed earlier.
He frames spirituality as a science.
Yes, he presented it as a precise science with observable stages of internal development. He described the evolution of the heart, meaning the core consciousness, through distinct stages, from a dark heart, ignorant and dominated by worldly desires, to a propelled heart, actively struggling towards the divine, to a clean heart, purified and attuned to God, which ultimately leads to the realized state of the saint, or Jivanmukta. His work provided a kind of scientific, non-sectarian framework for understanding this universal path of inner evolution.
And remarkably, this theme isn't limited to the East, or figures directly connected to India. Even deep within the Western Christian tradition, you find voices like the 14th century German mystic, Meister Eckhart, who seems to speak a very, very similar language.
Yes, Eckhart is widely recognized as just a towering voice of non-dual wisdom emerging from within the heart of medieval Christianity. He spoke, for instance, of a divine spark or fincline in the soul that is uncreated and uncreatable.
Uncreated and uncreatable. That sounds strikingly similar to the description of the eternal, unborn Atman in the Upanishads.
It really does. The parallels are hard to miss.
And Eckhart has that famous, almost paradoxical quote about the eye seeing God. It sounds very non-dual.
He does. It's often quoted. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love.
Wow. That's a classic articulation of that non-dual realization, isn't it? The experience of Christ consciousness, or Kutasa Chaitanya, where the perceived distinction between the seeker, the seer, and the sought, the seen God, completely dissolves into absolute unity.
Exactly. And his sometimes radical-sounding call to be free of God wasn't some kind of endorsement of atheism, obviously. It was interpreted by scholars as a profound injunction to let go of all limited conceptual images and ideas about God, all the names, forms, doctrines, mental boxes we put God in order to experience the infinite, formless Godhead directly beyond thought and definition.
Letting go of the concept to experience the reality.
Precisely. For Eckhart, just like for the yogis and the avatars we've discussed, the ultimate goal was not merely to believe in God or worship God externally, but to realize and fully embody the divine life within, to become a living, conscious expression of godliness in the world.
Hearing these voices, Vivekananda, Sri Yukteswar, Eckhart, spanning centuries, different cultures, different religious backgrounds, all echoing what sound fundamentally like the same core truth of inner realization and unity. It's incredibly powerful. It certainly challenges conventional notions of religious exclusivity and separateness.
Yeah, it really does.
Does hearing this shared wisdom change how you might view the relationship between different religions? Does it perhaps make you more curious about exploring the inner experiential path that these figures, East and West, seem to prioritize above all else?
It certainly invites a different kind of inquiry, a deeper look beyond the surface forms.
So, bringing this whole deep dive together now, the sources we've explored present a really compelling, if challenging, case for seeing figures like Jesus and Krishna not primarily as founders of separate, perhaps competing faiths,
but as perfect avatars, as divine incarnations who fully embodied and taught the path to a universal state of God realization. A state Paramahansa Yogananda termed Christ consciousness, known in the East as Kutasa Chaitanya.
And crucially, this state is presented not as something exclusive to them, but as a divine potential that lies inherent, if often dormant, waiting to be awakened within every single human being, within you.
Yes, that universality is key.
And their lives and teachings, especially when read allegorically and metaphysically, as the sources suggest, provide a kind of universal roadmap for attaining this state. The path, though expressed through different stories, cultural contexts, and terminology,
involves fundamentally universal principles. Cultivating intense love and devotion, Bhakti, performing actions skillfully, but with detachment from the results, Karma Yoga, and turning the intention inward through practices of inner communion, meditation, and concentration,
right.
Raja Yoga or Gnosis.
And it necessarily involves, as we saw, a deep process of purifying the heart and conquering the ego's lower nature, symbolized so powerfully by Jesus' mastery over temptation in the wilderness.
Right, and this essential inner purification can potentially lead to glimpses or even the full realization of the vast cosmic scope of the divine, as depicted in Krishna's revelation of the Virat Rupa to Arjuna.
And the ultimate, indispensable key that seems to integrate and unlock the entire process, according to these sources, is presented as surrender.
That courageous and conscious offering of the limited small self and its insistent will to the infinite divine will. We saw it exemplified both in Jesus' profound prayer in Gethsemane and in Krishna's core teaching of action without attachment in Karma Yoga.
And finally, we've heard how this same profound song of unity and inner realization isn't just limited to Jesus and Krishna. It's sung by a kind of perennial chorus of mystics and wise ones across different traditions and times, voices like Swami Vivekananda, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Meister Eckhart.
All reinforcing the idea of one indivisible self, one ultimate reality, hiding behind all the diverse doctrines and the outer forms of worship that we usually focus on.
So the core message from these sources, reiterated powerfully throughout, is that the true second coming, that hoped-for era of global spiritual awakening,
isn't necessarily an external event that we should just passively wait for. It's presented as the ever-present potential for the resurrection of this inner Christ-Krishna consciousness within you, the individual seeker, right here, right now.
The invitation, then, from this perspective, isn't necessarily about changing your external religious affiliation or adopting a whole new set of beliefs overnight. It's more about pursuing a deeper knowing, an experiential realization.
Yes. To consciously make the effort to turn from relying solely on external reports about the truth, what scriptures say, what teachers say, to discovering and confirming that ultimate reality within yourself through dedicated inner practice and direct experience.
As Paramahansa Yogananda himself stated, and these sources clearly highlight this quote, "Self-realization is the knowing in body, mind, and soul that we are one with the omnipresence of God, that we are one with the eternal, ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new bliss."
And he added, all we have to do is improve our knowing.
Improve our knowing. That leaves you, our listener, with a powerful question to perhaps ponder. If the divine essence, this boundless consciousness and infinite love, is truly presented as residing inherently within you, as the very core of your being, what does that realization, even as a possibility, actually change? What does it change about how you see yourself, your perceived limitations, your potential? How might it change the way you relate to other people, seeing that same spark in them? And ultimately, what might it suggest about your deepest purpose in this world?
It's certainly something to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Absolutely. We sincerely hope this exploration has given you some truly valuable insights and perhaps opened a new door, or at least cracked one open, in your own understanding of spirituality and your place within it.